Welcome to Newt's World Podcast on the iHeart Podcast Network. The greatest American inventions. Today's invention did not exist until 1998, but it is now so woven into daily life that most people under 40 probably can't imagine a world without it. The Internet search engine. By the mid-1990s, the World Wide Web was growing explosively. Millions of pages, billions of words, and almost no reliable way to find what you were looking for. The search engines of that era, Alta Vista, Excite, Lycos, Yahoo, ranked results largely by keyword frequency. How many times did your search terms appear on a page? The more often, the higher the ranking. The problem was obvious. Websites that wanted to rank highly simply stuffed their pages with keywords. Search for running shoes, and you'd find pages that mentioned running shoes 100 times, regardless of whether they were actually useful. Results were noisy, unreliable, often dominated by spam. Two Stanford PhD students had a better idea. Larry Page became fascinated by a question. What could the structure of web links tell you about the importance of individual pages? His insight was essentially sociological. When a human expert writes about a topic and recommends a resource, they link to it. The more experts link to a given page, the more authoritative it probably is. And links from authoritative pages should count for more than links from random pages. Page and Sergey Brin developed an algorithm they called PageRank, named partly after Page, partly after the concept. They built a search engine, ran it from Stanford servers, consuming so much bandwidth that the network administrators repeatedly asked them to stop. And they incorporated Google Inc. in a Menlo Park garage in September 1998, funded in part by a $100,000 check from Sun co-founder Andy Bechtolsheim, written out to Google Inc. before the company legally existed. The quality difference was immediately apparent. Google returned better results. It was faster. The interface was almost shockingly simple. A white page with a search box. Where competitors cluttered their pages with news, horoscopes, and advertisements, Google asked one thing: what are you looking for? And then it found it. Early on, Google processed about 10,000 searches a day. Today, more than 8.5 billion searches a day. Roughly 92% of all the internet searches on Earth. But Google became something far bigger than a search engine. AdWords, launched in 2000, let businesses place text ads next to relevant search results, paying only when someone clicked. This was precisely targeted advertising, infinitely measurable, accountable to the dollar. Traditional newspaper classified advertising, which had funded local journalism for a century, was eliminated in a decade. The consequences for journalism are still playing out. Google Maps transformed navigation and commerce. YouTube, acquired in 2006 for $1.65 billion, seemingly extraordinary then, modest in retrospect, became the world's largest video platform and its second largest search engine. 1 billion hours of YouTube are watched every day. Android, acquired in 2005, now runs 70% of the world's smartphones. I want to reflect on something I find genuinely important about Google's story. Page and Brin started with a question that was at its core intellectual rather than commercial. Can we use the structure of the web to rank the quality of web pages? They were graduate students trying to solve a computer science problem. The commercial application, the advertising empire, the media giant, the global infrastructure company worth $2 trillion today, emerged from that intellectual starting point. They didn't begin by asking how to build $1 billion business. They began by asking how to find good information. The good information question turned out to be worth $2 trillion. This is a lesson about the relationship between intellectual curiosity and economic value. The most transformative companies often emerge not from someone asking, "What can I sell?" but from someone asking, "What can I understand?" The understanding comes first, the value follows. 2 graduate students, a Stanford garage, a check made out to a company that didn't exist, and 8.5 billion searches a day. That is America. Coming up, National Park Service Ranger Shannon McLucas joins me to discuss the remarkable story behind America's national anthem. That's next. I am really pleased to welcome my guest, Shannon McLucas. Shannon has spent 14 years as an interpretive park ranger with the National Park Service, serving at Fort McHenry National Monument and Historic Shrine, Hampton National Historic Site, and the Star-Spangled Banner National Historic Trail. She holds a master's degree in history from the University of Maryland and has served as a research fellow at American University. As a historian, she has published research on a variety of topics in American political history and public policy. And she's joining me to discuss the fascinating story behind the Star-Spangled Banner, the life and legacy of Francis Scott Key, the Battle of Baltimore, and the defense of Fort McHenry, and how a poem written during the War of 1812 eventually became America's national anthem. Shannon, welcome, and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Oh, good morning. Thanks for having me.
I have to say, as somebody who used to study history, I really admire your career. I think it's very cool what you're doing.
Oh, thank you.
What sparked your interest in history?
I think a big part of it, when I grew up, my grandfather lived through the Depression, the bit of the 1920s and the Second World War. So I got to hear stories from these different time periods. And for me personally, it was always interesting to hear not only personal stories of what these eras were like, but then their experiences. And I don't know why. I was interested in literature for a while. So I think there's something compelling about human stories, about what people can accomplish. And different time periods is just something that draws you. You should know. You're an historian, right?
Did you grow up in Maryland?
I did.
So you've always been somewhere near Fort McHenry and the historic experience?
I have. And Maryland has a rich and complex history, so there's a lot of things to explore here.
Given how much time you had spent telling the story of Fort McHenry, when did you first visit the fort?
Oh, my goodness. I can't remember. Being a Marylander in Maryland in 4th grade, we take Maryland history. So I can't recall if my class took a trip here or not, because growing up in this state, we also have the good fortune of having the Smithsonian just down the road. And so we've had a lot of different things. But I do remember seeing the Star-Spangled Banner for the first time in Washington, and then learning that it was connected with my hometown. So I can't remember when I first visited Fort McHenry, but I had come here a few times and then decided it was a great place to volunteer. We have a wonderful cadre of volunteers. We have folks who are just starting out their career, and then folks who have retired and decided to serve their community as National Park Service volunteers. And they're all enthusiastic. They all love history, and they want to share it with people. So it's a wonderful place.
What makes all this so famous is a unique person, Francis Scott Key. Who was he? I mean, he happens to be at the right place to do the right thing, but he's also kind of an interesting guy.
He is. He is a very complex man. He's born, in Frederick, Maryland, at a place called Terra Rubra, which is the family plantation at the time. And then by the time we get to the War of 1812, he's completed his studies at St. John's College in Annapolis and established his own legal practice in Georgetown. He's also a member of the Georgetown Artillery. So he experiences the Battle of Bladensburg just before the burning of Washington. But as a Marylander, as a local, when we bear in mind that during the War of 1812, the British have been in the Chesapeake Bay since the spring of 1813. They've conducted raids throughout the bay. They've burned towns. They've burned small farms. And so the campaign of terror that's really instituted by the Royal Navy Key's reading about that. He knows people who are connected with that. So he's well aware of what's going on in terms of the War of 1812. It's next door. And even though he initially opposed the war as a Federalist, he starts to find that when the British are here in the Chesapeake Bay, that it is necessary for him to enlist in the militia. So he's in the Georgetown artillery as a quartermaster. And he serves, as I said, at the Battle of Bladensburg, which did not go well for the American forces, as you know. But he's sent to negotiate the release of an acquaintance, a physician named Dr. William Beans, who was captured by British forces not long after the burning of Washington, as the troops made their way back. And so Key, he's a lawyer, so he knows the law, but he's sent with Colonel John Skinner, who is a U.S. agent, and his task is to negotiate prisoner releases. It's a part of his job. So Skinner and Key, they hire a vessel, what we would call a rental these days, but they hire a vessel called the Stephen Decatur and sail out to meet the British. It's unusual. He is in the militia, but he's not really a military man. He's a civilian, you know.
Wait, I have to ask you something.
Certainly.
Weren't they a little bit in danger of then themselves being captured? I mean, if you go out and say, I'm an agent, the British may not decide that they accept you as an agent.
They do sail out under a flag of truce. And so there is an understanding that they're there to negotiate. And the British do respect that. We are, though, I'm glad you mentioned this, we are in an unusual circumstance because the capture of Dr. William Beans, Dr. Beans is arrested and he's a civilian. And at that point, the U.S. government has concerns about a civilian being taken captive by a military force. And so when Key and Skinner are sent out, it's to negotiate the release of Dr. Beans, but they do sail out under a flag of truce. So it's understood that they're there to meet with the officers and discuss this.
So they go out to see the British, and then what happens?
Well, they meet for dinner aboard the HMS Tonnant, and it's very civilized. They talk about why Beans should be released, that he's a good man, that he's an honorable man. And Key presents letters that were written by British soldiers that testify to the fact that Americans treated British soldiers well after the Battle of Bladensburg, because there were wounded British soldiers, of course, just as there were wounded Americans. There are letters that point out Americans had treated them well. And so when those are presented to General Ross, he decides, okay, I'll let him go. But the thing that places Key in a precarious situation is that he and Skinner and Dr. Beans have been aboard this ship and talking with these officers whilst they've made their plan to attack Baltimore. So that's what places him in this very strange situation, is the British can't just let him go back to Baltimore and warn them. So they're not going to allow that. And so Key, Skinner, and Beans find themselves in a situation where they are essentially placed near the command ship once the British squadron makes its way into Baltimore. So they're placed back on the Decatur, but they send some Royal Marines with them to make sure they're staying near the fleet. And so Key, as you said, he's in the right place at the right time by being at the wrong place. But he gives us a unique perspective, which when we think about the Civil War, we think about Matthew Brady's photographs. For the War of 1812, there are wonderful paintings by Rembrandt Peale, but the most memorable and powerful first-hand account of the War of 1812 that we get is Francis Scott Key's song.
When we come back, we'll discuss the dramatic events that placed Francis Scott Key in Baltimore Harbor during the War of 1812 that inspired the words that would later become the Star-Spangled Banner. Key is on the boat, and they're now going into Baltimore Harbor, and that means they've got to go by McHenry, right?
Well, they try to go by McHenry. So the British have a two-prong attack. On September 11th, they arrive in the Patapsco River. So that's a tidal estuary of the Chesapeake Bay. When they arrive in the Patapsco, Baltimoreans had been preparing their defenses since 1812. And so Baltimoreans, they sound an alarm when they spot the British fleet in the Patapsco River. And the defenders for the city go to their posts. So you have about 15,000 Americans at Hampstead Hill, which is modern Patterson Park on the east side of town. And you have about 1,213 defenders who come to Fort McHenry. And it's a combination of regular Army, regular Navy with the Chesapeake Flotilla. You also have militia units like the Baltimore Fencibles and the Washington Artillery. And then you have Sea Fencibles, who were essentially out-of-work sailors who are then trained by Army officers to serve as artillerists and infantry. And then 3 infantry regiments are sent to Baltimore to assist. This is also a great moment where we can see that Americans have planned their defenses well and that we're bringing all of these people together to a common purpose. When Key, Skinner, and Beans arrive with the British fleet, the first attack takes place on September 12th, and that's by land under the command of Major General Robert Ross. Now, as the skirmishing begins at North Point and Ross rides forth to investigate it, he's mortally wounded. So the British forces, as they proceed toward North Point and beyond, the American forces take a tactical retreat back to Hampstead Hill. Ross dies on the field, so his second, Colonel Arthur Brooke, will proceed to the eastern border of town. But what they realize when they arrive at the eastern border is that they're at a disadvantage in terms of the terrain because Hampstead Hill is an elevated position, and it's a fortified position because Baltimoreans, regardless of background, if you were able-bodied, you were digging entrenchments on Hampstead Hill leading up to this. And so the British realize they can't advance on the east side of town by land. So what they're doing on the 13th is relying on the Royal Navy to go past Fort McHenry to support them from the south. So they're expecting the Royal Navy to make its way to the inner harbor of Baltimore to fire on the city. But that's where things start to fall apart for the British, because they begin their bombardment at 6:45 in the morning. The HMS Volcano, the bomb ship, lets fly the first of what will be about 1,800 explosive shells at Fort McHenry. And that continues for 25 hours. So throughout that night, if you were in Philadelphia, you could hear the echoes of the bombardment of Fort McHenry. So Key is watching this with great anxiety from the deck of the Stephen Decatur, because he gives us the perspective of an American watching the bombardment of his fellow Americans. He can do nothing about it. He's witnessing it. And so the next morning, when the bombardment seems to have concluded, because remember, he gives us this line that's telling us the story when he says, "Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hail at the twilight's last gleaming?" What he's asking essentially is, can you see the flag that was flying last night? Because they don't know. They know that the firing has stopped, but they don't yet know what the outcome is. And Baltimoreans have the same anxiety because they're nearby. All they hear is the silence. And Key refers to this as dread silence in the second verse. And what he tells us also in the first verse that's familiar is he says, "The rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air gave proof through the night that the flag was still there." So while that firing had continued, he knew, well, the fort's still standing, the defenders are still there and active, otherwise the British wouldn't be firing. So that silence is what's terrifying to him and to all of the 50,000 residents of Baltimore, because they don't yet know what the outcome is. And so when we read the next line in the next verse where he says, "Now it catches the gleam of the morning's first beam in full glory reflected, now shines on the stream," we understand, oh, the garrison flag is now raised. So there is a sense of relief. When you read all 4 verses, it really fleshes out the story from anxiety to relief to essentially celebration, because when we get to the 4th verse, it says the Star-Spangled Banner in triumph shall wave. It's from the 4th verse, which is seldom sung, where Key writes, "And thus be it ever when free men shall stand between their loved homes and the war's desolation." And what's interesting about that is that there's a confidence in the future of the Republic. When he says, "Thus be it ever," the idea that there will always be people who will put themselves in what can be a very deadly space for the benefit of others. And so when we think about 250 years of United States history, we've had many generations who have placed themselves between their loved homes and the war's desolation. And one of the things that's interesting for me and resonates for me with the Battle of Baltimore is that it is one of a community coming together to that common purpose. So many of the defenders serving here at Fort McHenry, their personal homes and businesses were 3 miles away here in Baltimore. But there were many defenders here who were serving for the benefit of absolute strangers. They didn't necessarily call Baltimore home, but they were here nonetheless to protect a city that wasn't necessarily their own, but it was a city within the United States. And so Key's song, as you know, spreads very quickly throughout the young republic because it's performed initially it's performed publicly on September 19th. So just 5 days after the bombardment had concluded, it was performed publicly. And it's printed on handbills. It was set to a very familiar tune, to Anacreon in Heaven. And so as it's performed in pubs and coffee houses throughout the Republic and is printed in newspapers, the song spreads from Maryland up to Massachusetts and then down to Savannah within about 6 weeks. So it's about as viral as you can get in 1814.
But it actually had become attached to music that early?
Yes, very early on. And Key remarks on this later on in his life. He says, in that moment of deliverance and joyful triumph, a question sprung in my heart of, does not such a nation and such defenders of a nation deserve a song? And so he had intentions to write it as a song, even though it's first written out as the defense of Fort McHenry. The original handbills say, I think it's in parentheses, it says, to Anacreon in Heaven, because it's a familiar tune. Much like when we sing My Country 'Tis of Thee, it sounds a lot like God Save the Queen, because it's the same arrangement, but it's a familiar arrangement. And so pre-copyright, this is a way that a song could gain popularity. It was performed a little differently than we're accustomed to hearing it. The tempo is different, and the way you would sing all 4 verses is different. We're familiar now with the John Philip Sousa arrangement, which is what we're accustomed to. One of the things that's remarkable in the United States is that we have so many different artists who will sometimes, put a little style into it, use their talents in different styles to still give a good performance of the anthem. We have a variety of versions here in the exhibit areas, and it's interesting to see what visitors think when they hear different renditions of the anthem.
It almost becomes popular on its own by word of mouth.
It does. It becomes popular on its own. And an interesting thing to note is that if you read all 4 verses of the Star-Spangled Banner, even though the first draft was initially titled Defense of Fort McHenry, after that's changed and it's called the Star-Spangled Banner, as it spreads, if you notice in the lyrics, Fort McHenry is not mentioned, Baltimore is not mentioned. So it's not geographically tied to anything in particular. During the same September of 1814, the Battle of Plattsburgh is an American success. It doesn't have a song written about it, but the idea of an American success is what really takes off. There is a wonderful sort of underdog story in Baltimore in that the Royal Navy at that point, many of the same men who fought here with the British forces had defeated Napoleon. And so holding off what was then considered the superpower of the day was quite a feat. It was quite an astonishing feat. And so that notion of, as I mentioned, folks coming together to that common purpose, that sense of an American community, that's what becomes popular, I think, and spreads throughout the Republic. And that's what makes the Star-Spangled Banner endure.
It's about the symbolic survival of the United States captured in this giant garrison flag that's still there.
Yeah. The idea of endurance and resilience are things that are tied to the image of the flag. It's one of the things that I find interesting is when I meet visitors, most people know the lyrics to the Star-Spangled Banner, but they haven't really processed them and really considered the story. And here they learn the story about the battle, about the defenders. And so, yes, what Key does with the national symbol, the flag, up till that point, the national flag had a function. So it had a purpose. It would indicate a U.S. ship or a U.S. garrison, but it didn't yet have a story. And so Key and the defenders he's writing about ascribe a story and a meaning to the fabric that was flying over the fort. So now the Star-Spangled Banner, the image, takes on this story. So the flag and the song are very much woven together. And so during the War of 1812, many U.S. icons start to develop because during that period, we're only about 37 years old as a country, as an idea. And so a lot of the iconography, a lot of the things that we associate as Americana or very American images, many of them haven't been developed yet. And so with the song, the Star-Spangled Banner, and the flag, the Star-Spangled Banner, those two are tied together. And there's basically a convergence of national symbols that helps to start developing this concept of what we see as the United States that makes us a distinctive United States.
What did the flag look like at the time that Key is actually writing his poem?
Yeah, that's a good question. It looks a little unusual to the modern viewer. because it's the second design of the United States flag. And so it has 15 stars and 15 stripes. And so those 2 extra stripes and stars recognize Vermont and Kentucky when they joined the Union in 1795. But what's peculiar is that during the War of 1812, there are 18 states within the Union also fighting during the War of 1812, but they're not yet recognized on the national flag, which is rather unusual because when we think about Alaska and Hawaii joining the Union in the 20th century, they were almost immediately added to the national ensign. And so during this period, that tells us a little bit about the fact that the U.S. flag wasn't yet something that people felt compelled to update, to have it recognize or represent the United States as it is, not as it was in 1795. But the flags for Fort McHenry, the Storm flag, as well as the garrison flag that you see at the Smithsonian today, they were handmade by Mary Pickersgill, who is a local flag maker in Baltimore. Her mother had been a flag maker during the Revolution in Philadelphia. So Mary and her daughter Caroline, her 2 of her nieces, and a young African-American indentured servant named Grace Wisher handmade the flag over the course of 6 weeks. And they made 2 flags from English wool bunting, and then the stars are actually cotton and they're cut out. They're actually reverse appliqued. So it's a very interesting flag to go see. I always encourage folks to see the original Star-Spangled Banner at the Smithsonian. It's a wonderful artifact.
He's watching this battle. He's there overnight. When does he actually start writing? When does he put words to paper?
He starts writing not long after the bombardment. Because he's inspired, he starts writing some notes down.
Is he still on the ship?
He's still on the ship.
Wow.
But he begins it then. He doesn't complete it until he returns to Baltimore within a day.
It's literally contemporaneous.
Yes. If he had a camera, there'd be a snapshot. But we don't have that option, so he begins writing what he feels. And that's one of the remarkable things about the song is that, as I said, you're getting a first-hand account of someone who was watching the battle, watching its outcome, seeing the flag come up the next morning, and understanding the gravity of the situation. So he's giving us his emotional reaction to everything that's been occurring. And it's what makes it a very powerful song, is that it's written by someone who is there. It's not abstract. It's not thinking about something further away from you. It's actually being there.
Well, and to put things in context, this is during a period where the British are burning the capital. We're not doing all that well. So it becomes emotionally really important that McHenry stood and defied the British, and the flag was still there. I mean, it's fitting into a larger picture of being, I think, a little bit rattled as a country because the British were dramatically powerful in that period.
Oh, absolutely. About 3 weeks before the burning of Washington, which was a humiliation for the United States. There's that moment, but if you zoom even further out and look at the larger context of the War of 1812 and the end of the Napoleonic Wars, as the United States declared war in 1812, a big question, a big uncertainty was American sovereignty, or what many in Congress refer to as the national honor. So we're creating this new nation that had been established during the Revolution and its framework established with the U.S. Constitution, but it hadn't yet been tested on the world stage. And so the War of 1812 is a time where I sometimes think of it as the adolescence of the United States, because it's not yet established as, say, the United Kingdom, France, and Spain, these older nations, but it's finding its way. And so with the burning of Washington, there is that humiliation. But then the victory at Fort McHenry and also the victory in Plattsburgh, as you said, it's kind of an emotional upswing. But in realistic terms, I come from a small business owning family. Back in 1814, if you owned a business or you lived here in Baltimore, it had a tangible meaning of preserving your home and business and family, where throughout the Chesapeake Bay, many hadn't been. And so holding off the British here was a very important moment. And Key captures that for us.
I do want to ask you one practical question. If somebody goes and visits Fort McHenry today, what are the kind of places where they can stand and what can they see?
One of the things about Fort McHenry where we are truly blessed as a national park is that we have the original fort, and it's in very good condition. We're fortunate that the U.S. Army kept it in good shape, and so our preservationists continue to do that. So when visitors come here, they can walk through the fort itself, through the buildings, the barracks where these men served and lived. They can stand on the ramparts that Key writes about. I've told visitors, these are the ramparts that you sing about. You're standing on the very walls that he looked out over. And from those walls, from those bastions, you can look down the Tapsco River and get an idea of the layout of the land. So even though the port has modern ships in it, it's built up, of course, because it's still a very busy port. You can get an idea of the landscape and how the battle can play out. So I think if I'm giving a talk and people can imagine 5 bomb ships and 20 ships in the British squadron just on a horizon 2 miles from there, I'm having a good day if they can see it in their mind. Another thing that, particularly during the summer, is helpful for us is we have a living history program that's been around for 44 years. It's called the Fort McHenry Guard. And so we have a fife and drum corps, and we have cannon demonstrations, other musket demonstrations, and it brings the fort to life in a way that only living history can. So when we go through the Sally Port and you hear the fifes and drums playing, it brings it to life. So throughout the summer, our visitors can experience that, which kind of makes it a rich experience with the sights, the sounds, the smells of the fort with the black powder and everything. We'll talk with folks about a sailor's life and a soldier's life, and civilians as well, because civilians are very much involved in the Battle of Baltimore in preparing for it because their homes are at risk. So as I said, everyone had a role to play.
Coming up, we'll trace the surprising journey of the Star-Spangled Banner from the wartime poem in 1814 to the national anthem of the United States more than a century later. So now, take us through how the Star-Spangled Banner goes from wartime poem to song to the official national anthem, which takes about 100 years.
Yeah, it takes a little while. Part of it is because there's nothing compelling the idea of a national anthem. What happens is the Star-Spangled Banner, like Hail Columbia, which you may have heard, and Yankee Doodle, which was the most popular national air of the day. Yankee Doodle was actually what they played when they put the garrison flag up the next morning. A lot of these different tunes are popular national airs. So when I say that, if you went to a military ceremony, or if you went to a state occasion or any kind of patriotic celebration, you might hear these tunes. But it doesn't have the gravitas of an anthem. It doesn't have that status as an anthem. But it's popular. So it remained so throughout the American Civil War, and it remained so in the late 19th century. And one of the things to keep in mind in the late 19th century, particularly with regard to the Battle of Baltimore, is that as we move into the very latter part of the 19th century, many of the defenders of that generation is dying. And so as Fort McHenry's military value wanes, its cultural value, and when people consider what the place means, is increasing. Because by 1912, when the U.S. Army decides to decommission the artillery garrison here, Governor Austin Crothers of Maryland says the old fort shall never be abandoned. And he commits himself and the Daughters of the War of 1812 and the Sons of the War of 1812, a lot of the different patriotic organizations in Maryland, to preserving Fort McHenry itself. But also many of these people, including Virginia Houck Halloway, who was a fairly prominent patriotic Marylander, and then Congressman J. Charles Linthicum. Now we're involving the House of Representatives. And so J. Charles Linthicum introduces a bill to establish the Star-Spangled Banner as a national anthem. He also introduced the bill to preserve Fort McHenry as a national park. And so those two things are happening at the same time. Fort McHenry is established as a national park under the War Department in 1925. That's done through enabling legislation. But Linthicum proceeds with the bill to establish the Star-Spangled Banner as a national anthem. And so that's passed in 1931 and then signed by President Hoover. And so now it's established as an official national anthem, even though it had been a patriotic air. So much as the flag was still there, the song was still there almost 100 years afterwards and had endured. So it must have had a resonance with people in the late 19th century, well, the late 19th century, the early 20th century. That meaning seems to have endured. And since 1931, I know there have been discussions back and forth about whether it suits as a national anthem. And there are a lot of really good patriotic songs. But I think what's interesting is that message of people placing themselves between their loved homes and the war's desolation. That idea of endurance, as you said, the flag was still there. That idea still resonates with people. And growing up with the song as the national anthem, you just realize, oh, well, there's a deeper story to it, and there's a meaning that kind of sticks with us.
At the time it was adopted, was there any serious rival to be an alternative national anthem?
I don't think there were any. I don't know of any legislation for any other songs. There have been a lot of different patriotic airs, as I mentioned, but I don't know of any that reached the point where a bill was introduced to establish it as a national anthem. But it's also around the same time period when other nations are doing this too, because in the early 20th century, many nations are adopting specific icons. In the United States, there's an emergence of things that are distinctly American that's continuing. I don't know of any other ones.
Well, one of the great services you and the Park Service are providing is that, of course, McHenry is not far from I-95, and there are huge opportunities for Americans to go and to see a really living memorial to a moment in our history that I think really helped shape us as a country. I mean, I think not just the national anthem, but what actually happened there in that fight and in that period was really remarkable. And so I think what you're doing is a real patriotic contribution to sustaining the memory of what's made us America.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
I have to ask you, how will you be spending the 4th of July?
Well, the 4th of July here at Fort McHenry, we have a program we call A Glorious Fourth. And so what we do here is celebrate the 4th of July, much as they might have done in the 18th and 19th centuries, with a public reading of the Declaration of Independence. There's a local parade that I'm taking part in. And then here at the fort, we'll have our morning flag change that visitors participate in. So we'll raise up the Star-Spangled Banner, and then throughout the day have fife and drum performances and then weapons demonstrations. But then at 2:00, we have a public reading of the Declaration, which is something they would have done in the 18th and 19th centuries. And it's a great moment for visitors because we encourage visitors to join us in this, in reading the entire document aloud. By reading it publicly, I've had many visitors over the years approach me and say, I've never thought about this document in the way I have today. I've never experienced it. And so visitors will read the beginning and then all of the grievances against King George. It helps to establish, by the time you get to those last lines, when you say our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor, people realize what's at stake. For the authors, the signers of this declaration, they understand not only what King George had done to place us in this situation, but they also understand what is at stake for the people who put their name to that paper. I enjoy doing that. I won't be leading it this year, but it's interesting to watch children, adults, folks from all over have an appreciation of the founding documents.
That's great. That's amazing. Shannon, I want to thank you for joining me. I want to thank you for serving your country by helping educate so many people into an important part of our history. And I want to encourage our visitors to visit Fort McHenry National Monument and Historic Shrine. They can learn more by visiting nps.gov/FOMC. So thank you very much, Shannon.
Thank you.
Thank you to my guest, National Park Service Ranger Shannon McLucas. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcast and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Join me on Substack at Gingrich360.net. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.